Let me tell you what my deep research and basically vision is.
I hope there's Bigfoot. I don't think there is.
I'm not telling you nothing.
The aliens won't let it happen.
Happening now, breaking.
Bernie Sanders is angry.
Bears beats Battlestar Galactica.
What are the tips? Give me some tips on how to work with Wes Anderson.
Be ready to speak very fast and very clearly, because that's definitely one key thing.
I will only tell the truth.
Until you and 6 kids you barely know in wet bathing suits have surrounded 9 chimpanzees outside of a Wendy's. You probably really don't know yourself, okay?
Yep. And we back.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to your new favorite podcast and the best in political, sports, and paranormal news coverage. I'm your host, Wes Anderson, and this is In the Shed. This is episode 53, so whether you're coming back for more or finding us for the first time this week, hey, thanks for tuning in. My guest tonight is author, investigator, and head writer and editor for the Singular Fortean Society, Tobias Wayland. Tobias has been featured on television's Expedition X, in the Small-Town Monsters Documentaries Terror in the Skies, and On the Trail of the Lake Michigan Mothman. He's contributed to numerous books on the paranormal, is a frequent guest on podcasts and radio shows, as well as a speaker at paranormal conferences across the country. Tobias, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm very excited to have you on the show. To start out, Tobias, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, about the Singular Fortean Society, and about the work that you do there?
Yeah, sure, definitely. So the Fortean Society is an investigative and journalistic organization created by myself and my wife, Emily, who's also my partner in the Singular Fortean Society. So I'm the head writer and editor, and then Emily is our photo and video analyst in addition to doing all of the design work and making everything look great. So if you've seen either of my books, she's done the covers for those. I honestly like to tell people that she's the reason that I'm not just some lunatic ranting in green text on a black background somewhere on the internet, because literally I would have no idea how to make our website look as good as she does. So
she's very talented. Very talented. Shout out to Emily.
Right, yeah, absolutely. And so what we do is, like I said, we are in investigative in addition to journalistic organization. And so we like to go out and investigate things, but we also like to cover sort of the news surrounding paranormal phenomena. So I'm sure, as we're all aware of, especially today, these sorts of subjects do get some, mainstream press attention, but it's not always the kind of coverage that, I personally wanted to see. And so, when we were starting this thing and we were sort of finding our footing and deciding what we wanted to do, at some point, we landed on, covering these subjects journalistically, to provide that as a service for people who take them seriously. And there are now some other websites and organizations who are doing some similar stuff. But at the time that we started doing this, there was a real sort of lack of that kind of coverage. And so, as far as our approach, probably the two biggest questions that we get, first and foremost, really, is Fortean. What does that mean?
Right.
So anybody who doesn't know, who happens to be listening, Fortean comes from Charles Fort, and Charles Fort was an early 20th century collector of weird news stories, and so he would collect all these weird news stories from all over the world. And he would compile them in these sizable volumes, really, and then he would write about them, and he would write very speculatively, and he had this really great sort of tongue-in-cheek style, But he also took the subjects relatively seriously, and so he made all of these great speculations about sort of what could be behind everything, and he would connect various phenomena.
Right.
And so really he's responsible in a lot of ways for the theories and hypotheses that have come out of some of the most popular paranormal investigators that exist today, or at least whose work is still appreciated today. So well, for instance, I like to tell people that you really can't understand John Keel without understanding Charles Fort, because that's how big of an influence Fort was on Keel. And that's the same. A lot of guys, and well, not just guys and gals from that generation who were writing about this stuff. Charles Fort was sort of the inspiration for many of them. You look at like Keel's ultra-terrestrials, for instance, and it's very clearly Fortean. The idea of sort of this root phenomenon being behind a variety of seemingly paranormal phenomena, sort of linking these ostensibly disparate phenomena. Like, it doesn't get any more Fortean than that. And so that probably should give people a pretty good idea as to our approach when it comes to this stuff. And I also like to tell people about one of Fort's most famous quotes, because I think this really drives it home, at least it does for me. And that is, one measures a circle beginning anywhere. That is to say, by examining any aspect of the paranormal, be it ghosts, cryptids, UFOs, whatever's, you can understand something about all of it. And that's something that I've really taken to heart, especially once we started doing this. And then the other question we get most often is why singular? Because people think because we include that word that we must think that we're the only Fortean Society or something similar. But singular doesn't have to mean one. It has another definition, and that is unique or remarkable. And so I like to think that what we are, or at least what we aspire to be, is an organization of unique or remarkable Forteans. I think everybody's perspective is valuable. I think we all have something that we can learn from each other. And I think that the absolute best way that we have of advancing this field is to bring everybody in, have a seat for everybody who wants one at the table, and get everybody's perspective, because the reality of this is the most effective tool that we seem to have for identifying and recording paranormal phenomena are human perception and memory, and we don't have anything better than that, which is why most of the evidence is experiential. It's anecdotal. Right. In terms of people just reporting things that they have experienced. And I think that since that's where we are, we can fight it if we want, but I don't know that we even have the technological capability to measure whatever is behind these phenomena, or even the phenomena themselves, really. And since we don't, or at least we don't seem to, we might as well sort of play with the team we have, right? And right. And approach things experientially, at least for now, and I think by doing that, we can hopefully get a better understanding of what's going on. And so that's sort of our approach at the Singular Fortean Society. It's not that we don't do our due diligence when it comes to investigating sighting reports of Of course we do. I verify everything that can be verified in terms of, someone's testimony, be that geographic data or historical weather data or just anything at all that I can actually follow up on. There is a plate for, critical thinking and in good investigative technique. But, it's not like we have any sort of means of reproducing most of this stuff. It's very difficult to study in that way. And so most often what we're left with is a witness, often a single witness, sometimes, more than one, but usually a single witness. And when it comes to the phenomenon itself, whatever they've experienced, all of the information that we're going to get largely comes from them, and of course we can go into reputedly haunted areas, UFO hotspots, areas that are known for cryptid sightings, whatever. We've done all of that, and sometimes you can experience stuff there yourself, and
sure.
and we've done that, but it's not easy to capture. Even with recording equipment and everything else out there, you might get a little bit of evidence of something here or there, but largely, even if you go out and try to capture it yourself, most likely what you're going to be left with is your own experience and very, very little else, which at that point just makes you another witness. So that's kind of where we are, which is why we take the approach that we do.
I love it. I'm all in already. And the quote that you mentioned, I love that quote. You included that in the introduction of your book that we're going to be talking about. And certainly, Charles Fort has really shaped the narrative for a lot of people looking into the paranormal and into unexplainable phenomena. And you guys have really found an audience and have found a niche in doing that in a journalistic way. Tobias, what made you write a book like Strange Tales of the Impossible, and what were you setting out to accomplish in doing so?
Sure. So, Strange Tales of the Impossible is a collection of cases that Emily and I either investigated ourselves or were investigated by people that we know and have a close relationship with a very few exceptions. I included some things like the Joe Simonton UFO contact case of 1961. And
was that the UFO pancake case in Wisconsin?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. For anybody listening who's not familiar with Joe Simonton, I'll do a quick rundown of that story just for context. So, Joe Simonton in 1961 lived on a farm just outside of Eagle River, Wisconsin, and one morning he was in his kitchen when he heard what he described as the sound of how did he put it? I believe it was knobby tires on wet pavement, which is really descriptive.
It is.
I was impressed by that.
Yeah.
And so he hears this weird noise. He looks out the window and he sees this, not really a flying saucer. It was more ovaloid, really, of a craft with, these three sort of like landing gear sticking out from underneath it that had landed in his front lawn. And so he goes outside and there's a hatch that has opened. And looking inside of the craft, he sees, again, what he described as three Italian-looking gentlemen. I believe they were wearing uniforms of some sort, and he noticed one of them was making what appeared to be flapjacks on a griddle inside of this craft, and they didn't speak a common language, but through pantomime they were able to communicate to him that they would like for him to bring them some water. And he, being, Midwest polite, went and grabbed a jug of water for him and brought it back. And in exchange, they gave him three of their space pancakes. And that was the end of their encounter. Joe Simonton was a respected member of his community. He wasn't known for those kinds of flights of fancy,
right.
But he dutifully reported his encounter. It was investigated by Project Blue Book. They even tested the contents of the pancakes, and they were made of fairly normal ingredients. Nothing really special, certainly nothing out of this world. And their final determination on his experience was that he had experienced a kind of waking dream. They basically wrote it off as some kind of hallucination. And that's a shame, because he got a lot of crap for that,
Yeah.
He was mocked fairly relentlessly, and his overall opinion on the matter was that he wished that he had never come forward, frankly. And I think that's a real shame. And so that's really one of those cases that I like to talk to people about, because it's fun and everybody loves the space pancakes, and sure, I love them too. But at the end of the day, he was a human being.
Yeah.
And he had an anomalous experience, and he did everything right. He wanted to be a good citizen. He wanted to do his duty, and it cost him, and I don't think it should. So it really is one of those cases I think that illustrates quite succinctly how we need to offer basic respect to people. I personally like to something I call compassionate professionalism. I try to remain as objective as possible, certainly. So I'll follow up on everything I can and check all the details and try to find any sort of prosaic explanation, if one exists, because of course, if we don't explain the things we can, why would anybody believe us about the things that we can't?
Sure.
But as part of that process, something we have to take into consideration is that, like I said, most often, because of the nature of these phenomena, the evidence is experiential. And so we are dealing with witnesses, which means we're dealing with human beings. And they deserve respect and they deserve compassion. And that doesn't mean that you have to blindly believe them. Certainly, I've had witnesses that have come forward, and I have found prosaic explanations for their experiences, and some people are open to it, and some people aren't. But if you present it to them compassionately, if you're not making fun of them, you're not saying, "Hey, you're such an idiot. I can't believe you didn't realize that this one thing was this other thing." No, if you just sit there and sort of calmly explain to them, "Hey, this is what I think this actually was, and this is why I think that," then I think a lot of people, or most people rather, are receptive to that. I think they respond to it well, because you are meeting them as one human being to another, instead of coming at them from this place of condescension.
Yeah, and I think that your book does a great job of that, of approaching matters in that way, of treating people with compassion, of taking their claims seriously and investigating them. And that's a great example. I love the details in that story. I think we've talked about that on our show before in a previous episode. One thing that you did in your book that I loved, I don't recall which chapter it was in. It's been a few months since I've read it. I was thumbing through it again on my lunch break today. But I recall in your book you give an illustration to help the reader kind of think about these strange and unexplainable occurrences a little differently. And this is me paraphrasing. You will explain it a lot better. But you say something to the effect of that maybe some of these experiences are situations in which we as three-dimensional beings are seeing something, even if for a brief moment, that is beyond three-dimensional. Can you explain that concept to our audience a little bit further?
Well, sure. So, and this is not necessarily something that is unique to me, of course. There are a lot of researchers today who are sort of exploring the boundaries of, the dimensions that we as human beings seem to exist in. But, I think it's a very interesting idea. So, you can very easily imagine us as three-dimensional beings, of course. We have height and length and depth and as far as physical dimensions go, that's it. That's all we have. But we know at least that there are other dimensions, right?
Right.
And so, what might it be for something that existed in more dimensions than we do? Like, what would it look like if they interacted with us? And I think the easiest example of what it might be would be to consider what it would be like for us to interact with a two-dimensional being. So if you think of a being that just exists on this flat plane, and what we would be able to do in terms of interacting with it. Think about the surface of still water, and just the very surface is this two-dimensional plane of existence that this being lives in, and it's all they have. And if you were to dip your hand into and out of that still pool of water, you would seemingly appear and disappear by magic. It would look supernatural to them, because you could just enter and leave their available dimensions at will. And the other part that's interesting to me about that is they would never even see all of you. They would only be able to see a small sliver of you as it passed through their dimension. So they wouldn't even be able to ever conceptually understand what you actually were. It would be very, very difficult for them to even picture your actual being. And so I think when you look at some of the some of these cases, you have to start to consider things like that. We might only be seeing a very tiny portion of these phenomena, just interacting with a very small fraction of them that we're capable of even perceiving as it enters our dimension, and that might be all. That might be all we actually have in terms of ever being able to understand this stuff. It gets pretty Lovecraftian, frankly. H.P. Lovecraft, of course, the father of cosmic horror, and his big idea really was that there were truths to the universe that, were we to understand them, would drive us irrevocably mad. And of course, one of those truths was that we are very insignificant, and there are beings out there that are so far beyond our understanding that even observing a portion of them, would drive us insane. And I don't know that I would go that far, in terms of describing these paranormal phenomena that people claim to experience, but there's certainly a commonality there in that it very much seems as though what we're dealing with is something that we can't fully perceive. We literally aren't capable of seeing all of this thing, whatever it is. And so we see the little part that we get to see, and we're trying to understand the totality of this, while only ever observing a tiny fraction of it. And I think that is a lot of the difficulty we have, trying to investigate this stuff.
Yeah, and I think that that reading that really stretched my imagination and kind of helped me conceptualize these things that are unexplainable, that we can't make sense of. And our show, I say it all the time, even if it's a tongue-in-cheek news show, it is a news show, and sometimes I get flack, why do you have a paranormal segment in a news show? It's because there are things that happen all the time around us that are outside of our current scientific understanding that we just can't make sense of. So I love that description and that explanation. The way that you shared that really kind of highlights why we experience things that we cannot fully explain. Throughout your book, throughout Strange Tales, you share a collection of experiences. Some of them are your own. Some of them are reports that you've gathered from others, stories of sleep paralysis, of apparitions, of gargoyles and fairies, and all kinds of incredible things. What story or stories included in the book still astound you and stick out to you the most?
Oh boy, that is a tough one. I mean, there's just so many. I would say, obviously my own experiences have shaped me, but it's not so much the things that have happened to me, and by and large, I found that people generally don't want to hear somebody talk about their own stuff that often, because of I think there's a sort of like implicit bias that is perceived there, and so people tend to take those stories with a little bigger grain of salt. But one thing I can't ignore is the similarities between the things that I've experienced and the things that have been reported to me by people who had no prior knowledge of me and no idea about anything that I'd experienced. And so I'll talk to say Olga up in Rogers, Minnesota, right? And she started out relating to me a series of shadow people sightings that had occurred in her home. And the first one was when she was up late. She was speaking to a gentleman over the phone, and she noticed this shadowy figure sort of glide up the stairs towards her grandson's room. And so she has custody of her grandson, and he lives with her. And, of course, she was concerned, and she went up there, and she didn't find anything. But the next morning, her grandson, whose name is Toby, which, of course, is a fantastic name, right, climbed into bed with her, which he did pretty much every morning. And he wasn't very old at the time. I think he was probably 5 or 6, maybe even younger than that. I'd have to look it up. But he was pretty young, and he climbed into bed with her as he always did, or at least often did. And what was weird about that was, she was like, "Well, I'll get up in a minute," and then she got up to use the bathroom, and he ran in there with her. And he appeared to be very frightened of something. And when she asked him, what was wrong, he said that there was this red-eyed, monster basically staring at them, this red-eyed sort of shadow monster staring at them while they were in bed, and that seemingly appeared after she had got up. And so, this led to me questioning her about any other experiences that her family had, and she started talking about seeing mysterious orbs, like with the naked eye. I don't mean constant insects captured on an IR camera or anything like that. Like visible, like glowing balls of light that they saw with the naked eye. And there were some other sort of nighttime visitation events, had by other family members, up to and including having young family members staying the night, sleeping in the same room as Toby, and waking up to see a shadow person seemingly watching Toby while he's sleeping, which was all very interesting, And it had paralleled some of the experiences in my own life, because I do talk about, having seen shadow people growing up, and even having an experience where I woke up in bed. I guess maybe I can just share that one, because it is kind of relevant. So,
yeah, please.
This was in my early 20s, and I was living at home at the time. And, this was in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, so it's kind of in the suburbs, and I went to bed normally, and I woke up, seemingly no reason, There was no loud noise or bright light or anything that should have woken me up. And so
Right.
I found myself very suddenly awake. And there was some light, because like I said, it's in the suburbs, and so there's some ambient light sort of filtering in. And so I could see it okay. It took my eyes a second to adjust, but then I could see around pretty clearly. And I looked around my room. Everything seemed pretty normal for the most part, except for my perspective was skewed. And it took me a second to realize that the reason for that was that I was apparently floating several feet above my bed. And so when I turned my head to the left, I saw what appeared to be this shadowy figure. It looked just like a human male, really, but just all black. And so I see this thing, and I have the distinct impression that I'm not supposed to be awake for this. And so I very much could move. I decided it wasn't a good idea to move, considering my current state. And so really I moved my head, and that was it for me. And when I see this thing, it reached its hand out and put it on my chest. And so I always interpreted that as sort of it trying to comfort me or something, because I wasn't supposed to be awake. And maybe it's like, oh, well, hell, I don't know what to do. This guy's not supposed to be awake. And so once it did that, I was lowered back down to my bed, and then it very suddenly vanished. And what was really, really interesting about this was sometime later, this would have been a few years later, I was in Ohio for my cousin's wedding. And so, I mean, something people should know is that my family was not into any of this stuff. I had my experiences when I was a kid, and my parents didn't really know how to deal with any of it, frankly.
Sure.
And so I learned at a very young age that it just wasn't fruitful for me to involve them, like really, if I went and woke them up every time something scary happened to me when I was a kid, all I was going to end up with was grumpy parents, and so I stopped doing it at a relatively young age, and I would find other ways to deal with it. And the reason I mention that is because nobody in my family was really aware of my experiences past, relatively young age, so like past grade school. Like I figured it out in grade school that it just wasn't worth, waking anybody up or even talking about it. And so I just never did. But fast forward then to this wedding in Ohio, and my brother and I, after the reception, because everybody had gone back to either their homes or their hotel rooms, and so we were bored, and we decided we were going to go find a bar because we were in Dayton, Ohio, so we might as well live it up, right? And
College town.
And we find this spot, and we're having some drinks, and I got to sort of that level of buzz where I was maybe a little looser, and I was just like, hey, Will, that's my brother, have you ever experienced anything weird at mom and dad's house? Like, has anything weird ever happened to you there? And he thought about it for a second, and he was like, I don't know. Well, hold on. Now, there was this one time when I woke up, and I looked over, and I saw this like shadowy figure standing next to my bed, but I just assumed it must have been a dream or something, and so I rolled over and just went back to sleep. And when I heard that, because he had no idea about my experience, or really any of my experiences, when I heard that, I was just blown away. The idea that something so similar had also happened to him. And now, years and years after that, I'm talking to this woman in Minnesota, and she has a grandson who is similarly the focus of whatever these things are, and they are visiting him while he is sleeping, and they're watching him while he's sleeping, just like they watched me, just like they watched my brother. It's wild how all of this stuff comes together like that. It is,
and it's kind of creepy. I'm sitting out here at 9:30 at night in the shed in my backyard, and just hearing you tell that story is fairly creepy. I've shared this story on the podcast once before. I haven't had very many experiences personally. But the scariest thing that ever happened to me, and just hearing you talk about this, it kind of makes me think about it because it also was at night and it also was when I was a child. To give the Cliff Notes version, my dad was a pastor, and we lived on the same city block as our church building. And we had this kid that had started showing up to church on Wednesday nights. He was a local high school student, and he was very different, and he was very into the occult and into some different things. And essentially I had just been told, like, don't be alone with this guy. There's something about him that's kind of off, it's kind of dark. Just don't be around him when you're alone. And I thought, whatever, okay, I'm a fifth grader at the time. I remember after church one night, people were talking and mulling around, and then I noticed that he and I are the only ones left in the room other than the choir that's up front in the sanctuary practicing. And so I kind of remember I was told not to be around this kid. And so I slip out the back door, and I'm going to walk around the side of the church building to get to my house. And when I round the corner, he is there. And he's standing at the end of the street where I would have to pass him in order to get down the sidewalk to my home. So I am frightened as a child, and I turn around and I decide to just go the long way. So I walk until I get around the corner from this guy, and then I take off in a dead sprint. And I go all the way around the block, and then when I get to the point where I'm getting close to my home, inexplicably, he is also there under the street light at the end of the street by the stop sign. And it was a distance where it's not humanly possible for him to have been in one place and then been in the other so quickly. He would have had to have gone a very far distance very, very quickly. I can't imagine how it would be humanly possible for him to do that, but I very clearly saw him in both places and was petrified. I ran back into the building. I locked myself in the door. I was beside myself. I called my father, made him come and get me, and he carried me home. I didn't even walk. I was a fifth grader. He carried me home, and that was the creepiest and most unexplainable thing that I've ever had happen personally, that to this day, I've shared it on the podcast, but I really don't talk about it a lot for the reasons that you said. It's something that sounds ridiculous, that doesn't make sense, but it's also something that was a very real, informative experience for me.
Yeah, no, I can definitely see why. Obviously, like my mind immediately goes to things like like bilocation and other just like that kind of reported parapsychological phenomena.
Yeah.
But I don't know. What did you make of it? I mean, you were there, obviously.
Man, I really don't know, Tobias. And later on, I didn't know this till much later. My dad actually relayed the story to me that this same kid called our home repeatedly at like 2 or 3 in the morning, and finally my dad answers the phone, and he just is crying and weeping and demanding that the church be unlocked so that he could go into the sanctuary and pray, that he needs prayer, that he needs to be somewhere safe. And of course my dad was not doing that at 3 in the morning. He told him, I will pray for you over the phone. I'll be glad to meet you tomorrow. Please don't call the house a bunch of times. There are several things like that with this young man. I don't think that every time something happens that there is evil or demonic forces behind every bush. I'm not saying that. I'm slow to cast such aspersions, but in trying to make sense of this particular incident, for me it felt like a very ominous and a very dark presence, and I just, the overwhelming thing that I remember is the fear that I was not safe, and I can't explain it to this day. I can't explain it.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that. There are definitely people that would interpret that as or I should say, as evidence of some sort of malevolent presence.
Right.
I, of course, like most people, am reluctant to mention things like demons or
Sure.
anything similar, even, so far as like attachments, God forbid, like possession or something. But you hear stories like that, and then the sort of associated evidence of clearly a disturbed kid. You know, if he's calling your house and begging your dad for, you know, some sort of spiritual sanctuary, I guess.
Yeah, and the way that he
was looking for.
The way that he even got involved was that we had a new youth pastor, and how it was we just had a city block, and it had the church building, and then the house that we lived in, and then a house where whoever the youth pastor was would live. And when the youth pastor moved into his house across the lot from ours, he made it known that, you know, new folks could pop in or knock on the door, introduce themselves. And this kid, who he thought was just a member of the church, happened to come by, and he introduced himself, and then the kid would start showing up at all hours, unannounced, and just tap on his window. And he thought this was a kid from the church, and then the kid started coming to church, and we had these incidents and these situations that were quite bizarre. And even now, it just kind of, I don't know what to do with it. And there's a lot of stories like that in your book, and something that's interesting to me is that people are sharing these stories with you a lot of times for the first time. A lot of times these are situations and things that people have not talked about. Is that common, that folks are just very reluctant to even share that these things have happened in the first place?
It absolutely is, yeah. I mean, the most common narrative that I get from witnesses, and I absolutely understand this because, you know, I've dealt with similar in my life, is they will have this seemingly impossible experience, you know, be it seeing a UFO or a winged humanoid or you know, a ghost, whatever. That part doesn't matter so much, but they will have this experience, and then they want to talk about it. You know, we're human beings. We're very social. We that's how we deal with things. We want to share our experiences, and so they will go to a loved one, could be a sibling, a spouse, a close friend, a parent, whatever, and they will tell them their story. And more often than not, the reaction from that person that they want to trust, you know, to be able to share this powerful part of their lives with, will just laugh at them. You know, which I can't imagine a worse reaction. You know, you have this powerful experience, and you know, it's impactful. In some cases, it is traumatic. Yeah. And you go and tell somebody that you trust, somebody you feel like you should be able to tell anything, and their instant reaction is the last thing you would ever want to hear out of them, and it's to be laughed at and mocked, and then people just shut up about it. They don't want to talk about it anymore. Right. They still need to talk about it, but they don't want to because of that reaction. And if we're lucky, they stumble upon somebody like me, and they read an article or, you know, see a book or something, and they go, well, this person will take me seriously, and so they'll reach out. And,
absolutely.
And yeah, that's a lot of the experiences in Strange Tales. Are people who literally the first reaction they had from a loved one after their experience was just being laughed at. And that's why I think it's important to take the approach that I take when it comes to you know, speaking with witnesses. Is you don't have to be credulous. You know, you don't have to instantly believe everything a person says without following up on it or any of that. But what you have to do is you have to treat them with basic human decency. Right. And you have to hear them out, you know, and you have to take their testimony seriously. And part of taking it seriously is following up on it and trying to determine if it could be anything, you know, relatively normal, you know, if it's a misidentification or something, or even trying to figure out if the person is purposefully lying to you. Yeah. Although I've found that does not happen very often. Very, very, very rarely is that actually the case. But yeah, I mean, you just have to take them seriously, you know. Right. and that doesn't happen enough. Even among other people doing this, other investigators, sometimes witnesses aren't taken seriously enough, or some people will approach this with much more sort of strident tactic or strategy, where they will almost attack people. And their line of questioning can be very abrasive, and it's really just it just turns people off. It's
For sure.
People don't want to be interrogated about their experience. Questioning is fine. Interrogation obviously is over the line, but that still happens. And thus, for anybody listening, if you have any interest in doing this, you have to remember that these are human beings.
Yeah.
And they need to be approached in a certain way. Just imagine how you would want to be approached. Like, how would you want somebody to talk to you if you were relating this experience to them?
For sure.
It really is that simple. It's just empathy. It's basic human empathy, which you wouldn't think you would have to tell people about anymore. But considering everything that's happening in the world, I guess that is very much a thing we have to remind people.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that's something that you guys do very well in your approach, is that you do treat people in such a manner, and you do listen. You have to start with listening, hearing people out, hearing their stories, taking them seriously. One thing that pops up that's very prevalent in your work, in this book, you have a whole nother book where you wrote about this specifically. A lot of sightings of winged humanoids, both in the Midwest, in the Chicago area, close to the O'Hare Airport in Chicago, in a proximity to Lake Michigan. Tell us about that a little bit, and what do you think is going on there?
Sure. So my introduction to winged humanoid sightings around Lake Michigan began in the spring of 2017 with a trio of sightings that came into the MUFON case management system. So for anybody who's listening who doesn't know what MUFON is, it's the Mutual UFO Network. It's a citizen, or it's an organization of largely comprised of citizen volunteers who investigate UFO sightings. I was a field investigator for several years, about a decade ago or so. And so they received these sightings, and, they were unusual. All three of them basically described this large winged creature with attributes compared to either a bat or a bird. And very sort of limited contact with the actual creature, but the witnesses claimed to be close enough to be able to determine at least that it was something very strange. And not much was really done with them. These cases. I talked to Tam Bronto later, who's the state director of MUFON for Illinois, and they were never really able to follow up on them very well. It limited contact with the witnesses via email, and that was really it. And so, when these came out, I wrote a short article about them for the Singular Fortean Society. But I really thought that was going to be. I really did. I just figured it would be one of those things that came and went, and that would be the end of it. But of course, that's not what happened. Next thing I knew, we've got reports coming in left, right, and center of winged humanoids, and they really started sort of in the Chicagoland area. But as those sighting reports and the articles written about them gained traction, reports started coming in from further afield in Illinois, in Indiana, Wisconsin, even some in Michigan itself, and so they were coming in largely to a couple of different websites. Phantoms and Monsters, which is run by Lance Strickler, and then UFO Clearinghouse, run by Manuel Navarrete. And so I reached out to both of them, and I asked them if they would be willing to be interviewed, and I interviewed them separately. they seemed forthright in terms of their investigations that they've been doing so far, and their personal opinions, regarding what was going on. That is to say, they didn't really have many ardent opinions on what they thought was happening, which I always appreciated, because
Sure.
it really sort of speaks to a lack of any real firm bias, which is always nice. And so they definitely had some far out speculations. I'm not going to lie. Like, some of the things that they were willing to speculate about were pretty far out. But I personally think that's fine. As long as you let people know that you're speculating, and people shouldn't confuse speculation for belief.
Sure.
But anyway, I talked to them both separately, and fairly soon after that, I was asked to. Emily and I were asked to join the investigation, because we're fairly close to Chicago, certainly very close to the northern Illinois sighting areas, and we started getting reports sent directly to us at the Singular Fortean Society, and for the longest time. I was covering this, trying to cover it journalistically, of course, to try to be as objective as possible and only report facts. And I know people are going to hear that and say, really, you're writing about winged humanoids and you're talking about reporting facts. And listen, reporting somebody's testimony, as long as you say that, hey, this is what this person claimed happened to them, that's a fact. They
Right.
really did claim that happened to them.
Right.
I'm not saying that they absolutely saw exactly what they said they saw. What I'm saying is that they said they saw it. And so, like, that is, as far as I'm concerned, is still objective reporting of that event as they're describing it, right? So,
Sure.
And so I, for the longest time, trying to cover this story while also investigating it, I would use really, really clunky phrases like winged humanoid or flying humanoid to keep describing this thing. And as time went on, there was only one other event that I was aware of that had any real similarity. And then, after going back and reviewing the reports from that, I found it to be similar enough where I had to compare the two, and that was the 66 to 67 Point Pleasant, West Virginia Mothman sightings.
Yeah.
And so, at a certain point, I just started calling this thing the Lake Michigan Mothman, and I held off forever on doing that because I didn't want to sensationalize anything, because it's very easy to get something with a superficial resemblance to something else and slap a label from this much more well-known case on it to try to drum up interest. But I didn't want to do that. So once I reached that point where I couldn't ignore it, I felt like suddenly referring to this as the Lake Michigan Mothman, it wasn't sensationalizing anything. Rather, it was adding much needed context. And so, that's how I finally landed on that. And the height of the sightings was definitely 2017. There were still plenty in 2018. Even in 2019, and so on and so forth, all the way up to today, really. Like they're still coming in, not with the same frequency, but it's been quite a ride. Now, As far as what I think they could be, I think there are two sighting profiles that can tell us a decent amount about what people might be experiencing. Now, the first one is not super exciting, but it has to exist because we have to do our due diligence and we have to explain everything that we can, even if it's not, a super sexy, supernatural explanation. And that is a good amount of sightings. Probably my last count was something like 40% of the sightings were daytime sightings of something far away that the witness, didn't get the best look at because, again, it's flying at some distance, often backlit by the sun, of course, because it's during the day. And there's no accompanying, paranormal phenomena, anything like that. And those have a very high likelihood of being misidentified birds. And I landed on that because of some great circumstantial evidence that came to us in May of 2018. And so there was a young man riding his bicycle to work in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago, and he's wearing a bicycle helmet, so, good on him. And on that helmet was a GoPro camera. And so while he was bicycling to work, he happened to see this gentleman and this lady standing on the street corner, and were pointing at something in the sky that they clearly were watching fairly intently. And so he looks up, and he sees what he would later describe to me as this bat-like creature that looked really, nothing like that looked like nothing more than a man in a wingsuit potentially. So some kind of winged humanoid, basically. And he was sure that's what he had seen. And so again, he's got this GoPro camera, so he decides he's going to follow this thing around for as long as he can before work. And record as much of it as he possibly can, and he did, and that was great. And he was very forthcoming with that footage. He clearly felt as though he had nothing to hide. He even sent us the original SD card from his camera, which is not something people do if they're trying to hide anything, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And so with his help, we were able to isolate and blow up some really good stills of this thing, from this video, because it's a GoPro camera, so it's not super easy to see everything if you're just watching the video. But like I said, with his help, we were able to get the best example of this creature as it existed in the video, and blow him up and get a pretty good look at him. And it was a bird. It was 100% a bird. I would suspect, size and silhouette, probably something like a great blue heron, which if people aren't familiar with them, they kind of look like flying dinosaurs.
They're huge.
But unlike a lot of long-necked birds, when great blue herons fly, they actually tuck their necks back. They tuck their heads back.
Interesting.
And so when you see them from far away, you can't tell that they have a long neck. You just see this little head on what looks like shoulders.
Yeah.
And then they have these big long heron legs sticking out behind them, right?
Yeah.
And so it could look like a skinny person or like a bat person or something weird from relatively far away, which I totally get if you just saw it, especially if you weren't used to seeing it. And so the other bit of interesting circumstantial evidence that we have to support that profile is a lot of people don't know this, but thanks to climate change and the destruction of their wetland habitat, there are more herons roosting in like urban centers of Chicago than ever before.
Really?
And that number has blown up by orders of magnitude.
Really?
Since 2010. Yeah, I didn't know it until
I never would have thought that.
I actually looked into it.
Wow.
But there are actual ornithologists whose job it is to keep track of this stuff, right? And they do, and so that's how we know. But like, and when I say roosting in urban areas, I'm talking like Lincoln Park.
Wow.
Like in the middle of the city, right? And so, there are more of these birds in Chicago than there ever have been. And so people are seeing them more often. And the thing about something like a heron, right, just like a crane or anything else like that, is they're usually, if you see them, they're usually on the ground, because that's where they do most of their everything that they do. And so it is, well, for instance, I live up in Wisconsin, and so we get a lot of sandhill cranes up here, right? And you don't see them flying around very often. Usually if you see them, they're on the ground. They're rooting around for insects.
Sure.
And that's it. So it's relatively rare to see them flying around. But if the population suddenly exploded, you would probably see more of them flying around, just because statistically that becomes more likely in that scenario. And so I think what we had were a lot of people who were not used to seeing these giant, herons, these great blue herons flying around, and they have wingspans of upwards of 7 feet. So that's
a big bird.
And I think people there were a lot of people who weren't used to seeing them flying around, who suddenly saw them flying around, and it caught them by surprise. And so when they would report that they were seeing something that they couldn't explain, I think that they really were seeing something that they couldn't explain. I think that it was very much anomalous to them, or authentically relating their experience. It just turns out that their experience was of misidentifying this giant bird.
That's very interesting.
That's profile A, right?
Very interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting too. Of course, it's not the one people want to hear, but it's the one that they need to hear, because it validates in a lot of ways profile B. Profile B couldn't possibly be a misidentified bird if you believe the witness's testimony. And frankly, in most cases, I don't have reason not to. And so in that profile, what you've got is a much closer sightings usually. Often these sightings will be on the ground instead of in the air, or at least some portion of them will be. And there will be some level of associated paranormal phenomena. So people will describe things like glowing red eyes, or this feeling of unnatural fear, or of being hypnotized, or as though this thing is peering through them. These witnesses might also have other paranormal phenomena that begins happening in their life, either directly before or following their sighting. Like I talked to a witness out in Maryland, actually, so a little bit outside of the Lake Michigan Mothman sighting area, but very comparable case. And she talked about how after she and her son had a sighting of one of these things, they had this radio in their house that just kept turning itself on. It had never done that before, but after their sighting, suddenly this thing starts turning itself on. I had another case right here in Wisconsin where this woman and her mother encountered this red-eyed black flying creature in Madison, and around that same time, first the apartment that they were living in burned down, and then they began experiencing all of this weird, seemingly like haunted phenomena. So. Wow. One of the things, and they kept hearing like a baby crying, but there was no baby around, or hearing all of their cupboards fly open at night and everything, come crashing out of them, only to run into their kitchen and find nothing disturbed, like that kind of stuff, surrounding their encounter, actually multiple encounters with this weird, Mothman.
Birds don't do that, Tobias. Birds don't do that.
Right. Yeah. So, and what's interesting about that stuff is nobody volunteers it. Like, nobody volunteers it. You have to ask them specifically about it. In both of those cases I just mentioned, if I would have just immediately hung up, after they were done telling me about their winged humanoid sighting, I wouldn't know any of that other stuff.
Wow.
And so, it's not something that is that people necessarily connect with their experience, but I think that we shouldn't ignore the correlation in timing, right? At the very least, it's weird that this stuff seems to be happening around that sighting. But yeah, and so like all of that stuff, even if you took that and pushed it to the aside and just considered the creature itself, and the all black, the glowing red eyes, the feeling of unnatural fear. Some people have actually described it as evil. You don't get that in these misidentified bird cases. You just don't. People don't describe it that way. Because I'll ask them. I'll say, "How did you feel? How did the sighting make you feel?" And in the misidentified bird sightings, they didn't make them feel any way. They were just curious about what it might be, But in the potentially paranormal ones, it always evokes some very strong, negative feeling from people.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, that's the second profile, and it's much weirder, and I can't explain it.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because I think it's important to highlight the fact that some of these things are explainable and can be misidentifications of what exists naturally, and then very clearly some of these things are not that. And even in the response that people have, kind of highlights that, the way that you respond to seeing something in nature versus the way that you respond to something that is just other. And, you're talking about the incident of the baby crying. We had an incident here a couple months ago. I live in Alabama, and we live in town, but it's a small town in Alabama. And so my wife, she comes in the house and she's frantic that there is a child screaming and crying, and I'm like, okay. And she's like, but I don't see anyone out here. I don't see parents around. I think that there's a baby in the parking lot over there in a car or something's happening. And I say, okay. So I come outside to look, and it turns out that our neighbor has decided to get a baby goat and put him in the backyard. And and I, after a few minutes, I said, sweetheart, that is not a baby. That is a goat. It's right there. And so sometimes we can explain these things that make us feel a certain type of way naturally. And other times we just can't. We just can't. I hear a lot of theories in regard to Mothman, in these winged humanoid sightings, angels, demons, interdimensional beings, misidentified birds or drones, or all kinds of things. The theory that I enjoy the most, Tobias, and I'm not saying I subscribe that this is 100% true, it's just a fun thing to think about. Could they possibly be pterodactyls? Any chance at all?
I mean, I've received pterosaur sightings alongside the winged humanoid stuff, right? And so the pterosaur sightings that I've received bear a much stronger, a much stronger resemblance to the misidentified bird sightings than they do the weird paranormal, Mothman sightings. And I'm not saying that all the pterosaur sightings are misidentified birds necessarily. They're as mysterious as anything else. But what I am saying is that people's reaction to them is generally the same reaction that they would have to seeing a wild animal,
much more on the natural side,
a terrifying monster.
Yeah.
Think like awe or curiosity rather than
That's an important distinction.
Unnatural fear.
That's very interesting. You've been so kind with your time. Do you have enough time for just 2 more questions by chance?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Awesome. Well, you've talked about this some already, but one thing that I really appreciate about your approach to the paranormal is the seriousness and kind of the curious skepticism with which you approach it. So share with us, what steps do you take to investigate these reports, to verify the things that you can verify? What does it look like when a report of something unexplainable comes across your desk?
Sure. So, obviously we have to find out about the case somehow, right? So like maybe somebody will submit a report by email or message us through social media. Sometimes we'll actually have these cases sent to us by, a colleague or a friend or something, because sometimes, especially if people get something really weird, like we have a variety of friends and colleagues who cover, different areas of the paranormal. And often if they get something really weird, they'll just send it to us. They'll be like, well, this is really weird, so maybe you should look at it. So maybe we'll go get something that way. But, once you actually have the case, you've got the initial report, the witness, then, you have to follow up. And so ideally, what that looks like is contacting them. I usually begin with a phone call. Depending on the witness's level of comfort, sometimes it's only ever a phone call. So,
right.
Often that's as much contact as they are willing to have. But there are still things that we can do. Now, let's say that you're talking to somebody on the phone. there is information that you can get from them that you can verify, that can help you understand their sighting. Of course, the first thing you want to do is verify their identity. If this has never happened, but if I were to be speaking to someone and they wouldn't even give me like their name or something, then I would just simply tell them that, well, I can't help you then, because I don't have to tell other people their name,
right?
But I do have to know it, like I have to know it personally, and I think my work speaks for itself in the fact that if you don't want me to tell people your name, I'm not going to. And so, like first things first, you want to verify their identity, and from there, I usually take some basic demographic info. Like I'd like to generally know how old people are, what gender they identify as, and all that kind of stuff. Just as basic demographic info, it makes it easier to verify people's identity, of course.
Right.
But, it also is interesting to me from like an investigative perspective, really just honestly more than that, from like a data collection standpoint, where, you can sort of make certain connections by compiling that sort of that sort of demographic info. So you can be like, well, if we take all of this and put it like in a spreadsheet or something, and we organize it by age, like, are we going to see anything like unusual in terms of like who is reporting what, for instance?
Interesting.
So like I try to get like all of that stuff, and again, like people are more than willing to share that, which is great, because otherwise, I just can't help them, because I'm not really willing to sacrifice my own credibility,
right,
by investigating something in a way that is not up to my personal taste. And so it's sort of a two-way street there. Like I am going to treat them, with compassion and professionalism. And all I ask is that, people do the same for me. And there's a level of trust there, of course. And so like you get all of that. And then of course you want to hear about their experience. And my advice for anybody who's interested in doing this, if you want to interview witnesses, let them do the talking. Let them do all of the talking, or at least most of it. It's okay to interrupt occasionally with questions. Most people are not great natural storytellers. And so, normally what I'll do is say, okay, well, if you could tell me about your experience, like that'd be very helpful. Maybe start with the, date and time and where you were, and then just tell me what happened, and then, if I have questions from there, I will ask them, and you get through all of that, and I'll ask any follow-up questions I have. Often it's about, have you experienced anything else that you would consider unusual, especially either, directly preceding or following your sighting or whatever happened to them. And just basic stuff like that. And if they're willing, I always like it if they would be willing to take me out to the actual sighting location, which is always helpful.
Yeah.
That doesn't always happen. Some people don't want to. They're not necessarily comfortable doing that. Well, for instance, I don't think I mentioned this, but it does come up with relative frequency. Obviously people are often uncomfortable talking about this stuff. And it's not just because they're worried about being made fun of. Some people are legitimately afraid that talking about this stuff or involving themselves in some kind of investigation or something will attract whatever it is that they experienced back into their life. And they are so afraid of it that they're just unwilling to take that risk.
Yeah.
And so they don't want to have anything to do with it. They've told you their story. That's the end of their involvement. They got whatever cathartic release comes from that, and they feel like they've done their part. Because part of this is that I think people are generally good, and they want to help people. And when they have an experience like this, one of the ways they think they can help people is by sharing their experience. To either get other people to come forward or let them know that they're not alone, or some similarly benevolent motivation. But anyway, so if I can get them to take me to the sighting area, that's great. Barring that, telling me the precise, sighting or the precise location of the sighting is a close second, because at least then I can go out there, right? Now, there is some difficulty in that where some people don't remember exactly where it happened. This is common when people are driving and they have some kind of encounter while driving. They might be like, well, I was on such and such street, or I was driving on this highway, but it's a huge highway, and I don't remember, I didn't see a mile marker, so I don't remember which part of the highway I was on. And so there can be some difficulty there, but if I can get the precise location out of them, I do, and then if I can get out there, I will. I guess there is one caveat there, though, where some of these sightings, they might be days, months, or years old by the time they are reported to us. And so in the case of something being years old, there's likely, well, one, the sighting location has probably changed. If it hasn't, it's not like you could reasonably expect to go out there and capture this phenomenon. So at this point, really what you would be doing is just trying to verify geographic details, as they were related to you from the witness. And so that is useful, obviously. It's not something that always need to go to the sighting location to do, because we live in an age of miracles, and I can go on the internet and get a satellite image of almost any place.
True. Yeah.
And so, if you want to do it, great. And I always will if it's convenient, for instance, but if a sighting is years and years old, then in terms of making sure to go to the actual sighting location, it's less of a priority. But if it's relatively recent, then of course, if I can, I want to get out there, because sometimes you do get, not necessarily the core phenomenon, but you might experience something weird while you're out there. It's happened to us before, and so it's useful. And then, of course, in terms of really understanding the witness experience, anytime you can get out to the actual sighting location and around when they were there, you can learn things that you won't be able to see from a satellite image.
Yeah.
And so it is, I don't want to downplay the utility of actually going to sighting locations and seeing what there is to see out there. I think people definitely should. But there are certainly cases where either it's impossible to get out there, or it's not really feasible. And one of the ways that I rationalize that to myself is if the case is old enough, then you're unlikely to find anything weird while you're out there. That, of course, flies out the window if it is in like a high sighting location or area. So if you've got an area with a lot of sightings in it, and you get another sighting report out of that area, even if it's pretty old, it's worth investigating that area. So anyway, if you can get boots on the ground, it's pretty much universally better to do that than not to do that, if humanly possible. So we do try to get out to as many locations as we can.
Yeah.
And then from there, it's a lot of verifying data, basically just verifying info. Like I mentioned before, just making sure all of the geographic data matches up with their testimony. If there is historical weather data, I always look at that, because it can tell you a lot about what's possible, for instance. So if somebody is talking about, seeing lights in the sky, like they see some anomalous light, some UFO or something, and they've got the specific time and date and everything, and the at least relative location of where they were, you can look at weather data and say, like, okay, well, like, what was cloud cover like, right? And so once you look at that, you can rule some things out. You're like, well, okay, according to this witness's testimony, they saw this weird light. And, looking at the historical weather data, I can see that the cloud cover, was it was thick, and the cloud ceiling was at a certain height. And so we can rule out, things like stars and satellites and things like that, because there's no way that they would have that they would be likely to have seen that through those clouds. And then if you look at the cloud ceiling, you go, okay, well, the clouds were at a certain height, so it's unlikely that they had seen a plane or something, because maybe the plane would have been like actually above the cloud cover or something similar, I guess. And that's all, of course, a hypothetical that
Sure.
I just came up with, but you can find a lot of useful information. Check historical weather data is really all I'm getting at. And so anything like that you can verify, you really, really want to. So think of any details that you could actually verify out of a witness's testimony, then go ahead and do that. If they mention that they have a specific career or something, I wouldn't call their work and be like, hey, I'm a paranormal investigator, try to follow up on this, don't do anything like that. But it's not unreasonable, if it's relevant to their sighting, to be like, oh, that's really cool. Do you have, is there some way I can verify that you actually work where you say you work? Like if they said that they had a sighting while they were at work, like experience takes place at their job or something, then if as long as you can verify that they work there, and most people have something, like you have an ID badge or something that they can show you just to prove that they work something. Yeah, I mean, really, it's a lot of sort of tedious fact checking.
Yeah.
And that's what you have to do. And once you've done all of that, you get to the end of all of that, and then you look over it. If everything sort of matches up, then you actually have something.
Yeah.
That's most of what we do. Now, if we're going on site somewhere, that can get a little more exciting, although often it's just a lot of sitting in the dark. But sometimes we might bring out spirit boxes, or have like an Estes method session, or use other techniques to try to communicate with anything that actually be residing in that area. We have a variety of cameras and things that we'll take out, and we have caught some cool stuff. So I don't want to make it sound super boring. A lot of it can be pretty boring, but if you actually care about this work, you have to go through it with all of that stuff, because it's just doing your due diligence.
And that's what
you just kind of have to.
That's what I appreciate about your approach, is that you do have, I would even say it's a level of journalistic responsibility and a journalistic standard, that you do verify that the way they describe the weather, you go back and look at historical weather patterns. You verify that they worked the job they said they worked, that they were in the location, and that it looks like what they said it did. And a lot of times in paranormal research and investigation, the perception is that someone said they saw something and you just ran with it, and that is not what you do. You actually investigate, and I appreciate that about you for sure. That's very cool.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I wanted our listeners to kind of get an idea of what an investigation looks like. So thank you for sharing that with us. My last question for you, Tobias. In your work, there is a term that pops up time and time again. It's mentioned in your book, and I would love for you to kind of define for our listeners what you mean by it, or what it means to you. And that's this idea of high strangeness. What does high strangeness mean to you?
Sure. So high strangeness is basically anything that sort of completely breaks our paradigm of reality, right? So that can be a pretty big box to try to put things in. But I think it's not easier to sort of define through phenomena. So like, for instance, if you've got somebody reporting anomalous lights, that in and of itself is not high strangeness, because that could be a variety of phenomena that is explainable within our current mode of thinking, right? So,
right.
If it's like just like a glowing ball of light, like some people will report like basketball-sized glowing balls of light. Well, I mean, we know about meteorological phenomena like ball lightning,
Mm-hmm.
So within physics and within science, as we know it, stuff like that is possible. So that's high strangeness. If you see a light in the sky, I mean, planes and drones and all of these things exist, and so maybe it's an experimental aircraft or something, but it could be in actual aircraft, created by somebody on Earth. So that falls within, our consensus paradigm of reality. But you get a case like Joe Simonton.
Yeah.
And that doesn't make any sense.
Nope.
That's high strangeness. Like that. How would a craft like that fly? Why were they making pancakes?
Why did they look Italian?
Is very, very weird. Other stuff like I had a report of a time slip, which it was in the Okefenokee Swamp, actually.
I've been there.
And that to me is high strangeness, because we don't know that time travel is possible. There are some people way smarter than me who theorize that it might be, but we don't know that it is. And there are some other really smart people who theorize that it isn't. So, that breaks our current consensus reality, and so I chalk that up to high strangeness. Similar would be Mothman. There's no way, given our current understanding of biology, that something with the dimensions as described by witnesses, that something with the dimensions of Mothman should be able to get off the ground. There's just no way. And so that in and of itself is high strangeness. And then you talk about glowing red eyes. Now, obviously, we know that anybody who likes to go out in the woods at night or is a hunter or whatever, we all know that eye shine is a thing. Of course it is. But a lot of people describe what looks like these sort of like self-illuminating eyes, right? When they're talking about these glowing red eyes, you ask them, you're like, okay, was it eye shine? And they say no. It looked like the eyes were glowing like a a Christmas bulb or something, right?
Wow.
And so, that is high strangeness. So yeah, I guess fundamentally what I'm getting at is anything that violates our sort of the paradigm of what we consider consensus reality.
Yeah.
Anything that acts in violation of the physical laws of the universe as we understand them, that's high strangeness.
And that's why we talk about paranormal news on this show. All the stuff that you just said. That's why it matters. That's why it's important. And shout out to my mom and dad for taking me on family vacation to the Okefenokee Swamp as a child. Very, very, very funny that came up in conversation. Tobias, you have been incredibly kind with your time. I've had a great time and have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Your book that I have read, Strange Tales of the Impossible, I read it in 2 days over the weekend several months ago when it came in the mail. Terrific book, very thorough. Love the way that you approach this topic. What are you working on currently? How can our listeners support your work and keep up with what you're doing?
Sure. I mean, we're always covering any weird news. So, of course, if you want to keep up with what we're doing at the Singular Fortean Society, you can visit our website at singularfortean.com. You can also follow us on social media. So just look for the Singular Fortean Society on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr. I believe Emily is actually working on a TikTok.
Awesome.
very soon too. So look for that if you enjoy that platform as well. If you're interested in my books, of course, them on Amazon. We also sell autographed copies through our website, so just singularfortean.com/books. And then, if you're interested enough in what we do that you want to be a part of it, you can always check us out at patreon.com/singularfortean.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, he has been Tobias Wayland. We're so thankful for you being on our show and illuminating a very important and interesting topic for us. Thank you so much for joining us, Tobias.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's all for this week. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. I can't either. It's back in the house and out of the shed for me. Thanks again for listening to episode 53. Make sure to subscribe, like, share, and review. It really does help. If you have any paranormal experiences, opinions about sports, or politics that you'd like to share, you can email the show at intheshedwithwes@gmail.com. Again, that's intheshedwithwes@gmail.com. I might even read it on air. Look for us on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, the Good Pods app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to follow us on Twitter at InTheShed4. Tune in again next week when we'll hit the headlines, talk some sports, and investigate the Mattress Firm conspiracy together. This has been In the Shed with Wes Anderson, the best news show in the land covering politics, sports, and the paranormal. Have an adventurous and fulfilling weekend. I'll catch you tools later. Peace out, Boy Scout. Meemaw, we made it!